Large-scale protests have erupted in major cities across China, calling not only for an end to the COVID-19 policies, but also for an end to the ruling Communist Party. This was sparked partly by the zero-COVID policy of CCP leader Xi Jinping, which has resulted in harsh lockdowns, economic damage, and even deaths. The protests take place at a sensitive time for the CCP, and how the regime responds could determine its future. Benedict Rogers, a renowned British human rights activist and author of China Nexus, 30 Years in and Around the Chinese Communist Party's Tyranny, breaks down the evolution and various atrocities perpetrated by the CCP over the past 30 years. Rogers explains the significance of the current protests, how they are likely to impact global events moving forward, and why Americans should care. Hey, Benedict Rogers, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for coming to the U.S. I know you just wrote this new book, The China Nexus, and the timing couldn't have been better because you're talking about Chinese human rights, and here we are, large-scale protests in China. Jiang Zemin just died. Chinese human rights are front and center.
Absolutely. I mean, we couldn't have planned for this, but it has been extraordinary. As we've launched the book in different cities, we had the incident of Hu Jintao being removed from the party Congress. That was a few days before the London launch. We had the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz going to Beijing just after Xi Jinping secured his third term, and that was around the time of the Brussels launch. We had Xi Jinping's encounter with Justin Trudeau just as I was arriving in Canada, and then this past week the extraordinary protests across China whilst I've been here in the US. So I'm grateful to the Chinese Communist Party for helping create an environment that makes the book very topical.
Well, and you're in an interesting position because you're talking about human rights in China, and you're not limiting it to just one group. You're talking about pretty much the whole spectrum of what's been going on there. I know you're involved in the tribunals on organ harvesting. You're talking about the Muslim Uyghurs, the House Christians, Tibetans, Falun Gong. Not everyone touches on the full picture, and that's what you're doing with this book. So it's an interesting time. I want to talk first, though. In your book, you mentioned something very interesting, which is the United Nations. And a lot of people, when they, maybe not these days, maybe becoming more aware, but these, a lot of people, when they think international human rights abuse, where do you go? You go to the United Nations, you bring it up there, and you hope they do something about it. You expose something very concerning, which is there's a slush fund involved in this. Tell us about this.
Yes, so before I started researching the book, of course I was aware of China's influence at the UN, its ability to effectively buy votes on resolutions. But what I was not aware of was the extent to which China has basically bought and penetrated the office of the UN Secretary General himself. And I only learnt about this through interviewing Ambassador Kelly Curry, the former US ambassador to the Economic and Social Council at the UN. And she was one of, I did about 80 interviews for the book. But she told me in some detail that basically China has given $10 million to the Secretary General's office, and the oversight of this fund is only with the Secretary General himself and some Chinese appointees. So there's no accountability beyond that, and it's basically for the Secretary General to spend as he wishes on development projects. But totally in partnership with China. And I had always wondered with this particular Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he's been completely silent on the Uyghurs, he's totally silent on the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, he's silent on all the other issues in China, and on some of the neighbouring issues, North Korea and Burma or Myanmar, he's said very little. And I used to wonder why he's so inactive and so quiet, and I think now we can understand why. He's basically been bought by China.
Well, that is concerning, but it makes sense because we can look at the actions of the United Nations. I mean, we can look at I think most of the focus has been individual branches of the UN, right? Individual agencies, but what you're saying is from the top. This is from the top. And you're saying bought off. That's a strong statement. Can we say bought off?
Well, in a way, I think we can, because this fund that, as I say, is only accountable to the Secretary General and to the Chinese funders, certainly suggests that there's no coincidence between that and his inactivity on China human rights issues. And it was, Ambassador Kelly Curry who told me this. She's very willing to talk about this publicly, although she told me that I'm the first person to actually be willing to quote her on it. She's offered it to other media, and they haven't taken it up. But
that's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, that's the top level. That's a big deal. The other concerning parts are there as well. We actually did an infographic at Epoch Times, maybe a year ago or several months ago, where we looked at the different agencies of the United Nations that have Chinese Communist Party members as leaders, and there's a large number of them. We can talk about the Human Rights Council, which of all things you would not expect the CCP to have leadership positions in, but they do. And we can look at the behavior of the UN, so, the UN Human Rights Council and what they've been doing on human rights. They're more going after the United States than they are anything else, and North Korea involvement and so on. It's very strange. And then we can talk also about World Health Organization, which cannot demonstrate its independence from the CCP. And a lot of people would say, oh, well, so what if it's a Chinese leader? If you're with the United Nations, you no longer recognize your own nation, your United Nations, and there's a separation. But if we remember Interpol, international police, essentially, there was a CCP head of that as well, who was actually punished by the Chinese Communist Party for not enforcing the CCP's laws through the United Nations. What do you think that tells us about, in your studies, how much control does the CCP actually have over the United Nations, and how have you seen them using it?
Well, I think it has fairly extensive control, and that's illustrated in two particular ways, among many others. We saw just very recently, a month or two ago, the defeat of a resolution at the Human Rights Council by just 2 votes on whether the Human Rights Council should discuss the UN High Commissioner's report on the situation of the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region. And it's extraordinary that even a resolution that was as mild as that, just creating an agenda item for the Human Rights Council, was able to be defeated because of China's influence. But I think one other anecdote which I describe in detail in the book is that Dolkun Issa, the president of the World Uyghur Congress and a very respected human rights activist for the Uyghur people, who's received many awards for his work around the world, Interpol had red notices for him. He was arrested in several different places, but also even though he was invited to the UN by the US mission, he was denied accreditation because China objected to him being allowed into the building. So it can go to as basic things as that.
Yeah, they don't let him in the first place then.
Yeah.
We also know stories, for example, of people going to actually testify in front of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, the UN Human Rights Commission reporting these people to the CCP, and these people being arrested before they can go and testify. Alex Newman, investigative reporter, was doing some reports on that. It's shocking stuff, actually.
Absolutely.
I want to get into some of the issues happening right now, the student protest, well, not impressive, the protests happening in China. But I want to talk about your story first. And also, I want to get into the different groups persecuted, because not many people focus on all of them. But you have an interesting story. You're someone who deeply appreciates Chinese culture. You were teaching in China. What happened?